So I want to explain to you about cake boards, and what's really exciting, or quite exciting, is that we're actually getting coloured cake boards that are actually coming into Australia. And recently I went to America and they've got all these beautiful cake boards as well. So what's lovely about them is they're actually covered in a really nice decorative paper. So they're actually food proof. So basically we can put our cakes on the boards without actually having to cover them. And at the moment we've got them in pink and the pale sort of aqua blue. But when I was in America, they had loads of other different colours. So what's great about these boards is that we don't actually have to then cover them. So we can use them as part of the design. So if you had like a nice black and white themed cake, you could use the pre-coloured covered boards. But in this tutorial, I'm actually going to show you how to cover a board with fondant. But I just thought I'd show you these boards because I think they're great. Now here in front of me, I've got a cake board that's already covered in fondant, and that's nice and firm. And advice really is to cover them a few days before you need to put your cake on, so that they're nice and firm. And this other cake here, I've actually got the cake fixed and glued in position when I ganache the cake. In one of the tutorials you'll see this video. But in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I cover this cake board as well. So I'm going to show you how to cover the cake board, and I'm going to show you how to create a lovely marbled effect for this fairy cake design. So now I'm going to show you how to cover a cake board with a fixed cake in position. So this cake was actually glued, the board was actually glued in position, and then I set up the cake and then I ganached it, and that's showable in another previous tutorial that we've shot. So this cake is actually glued in position. It's already got a board underneath it, the same size as the cake, and the cake was a 7-inch round cake, and the cake board was a 7-inch round cake board. And then what I did to make it easier, I actually glued the cake board in position, and then I set the cake up and ganached it, and then I covered it with fondant. Now what I've done is I've actually got a spare cake board. Now you could use a large chopping board. Make sure it's got no raw onions or anything on it. But what I do is I just use a spare cake board, and I've got a piece of non-slip gripper mat, and I've popped my cake onto the cake board. And what that does, it helps me then move my cake around without me putting my beautiful thumb marks on the cake board. So I'm going to need a few little tools, and the first thing I'm going to use is a pastry brush, and I'm going to put some water onto the actual cake board. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to secure a few little balls. Now I'm going to make my join at the top. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a dot of fondant at 12 o'clock and a dot of fondant at 1 o'clock and another at 11 o'clock. This is just temporary, but this is just a reminder for me not to put any water in that area, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a join and an overlap of fondant, and I don't want a lot of water in that area. So I'm not putting any water in that area there, okay? So just a small amount of water, and this is just ordinary water with a pastry brush, and I'm just doing a slight dot or a zigzag, but I'm not putting any water in that area there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a marbled effect on the cake board. So I'm going to get some white fondant that I've already conditioned up. So I've kneaded it up and it's nice and warm. And I'm just going to gently just knead it to one side of the bench, because I don't want to roll out in front of me when I roll out, otherwise I'll get a scuff mark on the bench and then my fondant will stick. And then what I've got is I've got some pre-coloured pink fondant. And I'm just going to break off the fondant and just break small pieces off into like wiggly worms, okay? Now we don't have pink worms in Australia, but they are wiggly, okay? So just a few. And what I've also used is I've used two different colours of the pink. I've used the Wilton hot pink, and I've used the Wilton lighter pink. It's like a pale rose pink, I think. So I'm just going to wiggle well, I'm not going to wiggle, but I'm going to wiggle the fondant into wiggly worms. And then I'm going to get some paste gel colour, and with a toothpick, and I'm going to flatten the fondant. So I'm going to flatten it like a pizza or a bit of focaccia bread, and I'm just going to randomly put the pieces of fondant on top, and then I'm just going to knead it in a little bit. So as I knead, I'm slightly rocking on top of the fondant, pushing down. I tend to keep my hands quite flat when I knead because I find that if I grab the fondant, it increases the heat and the fondant becomes quite stretchy. So I'm just going to pinch it back up again, and I'm going to put a few more random wiggles on top, and then I'm going to just get a few little streak marks of the pink. Now if I want this really quite bold, I can add quite a few of those marks, and then I'm just going to pinch it back up again. The downside is you sometimes get pink on your hands, but you kind of can't sort of stop that. And so I'm just going to knead the fondant, and then I'm going to just twist it so that my colour starts to come through. Okay. Now it's important that you pinch underneath, pinch the bottom, because you don't want a hollow section when you roll out, because if you don't pinch that bottom, if it's hollow, when you lift it up, you'll have a hollow area. Now, with my cake board that the cake's positioned on is a 12-inch. So what I've got is a 12-inch board as a template guide, and I've also got a smaller cake board. It's a 6-inch. So the actual cake is 7 inches, but I've got a 6-inch cake board. You're going to need a smaller 1-inch size template, smaller than the cake. The other tool I'm going to use in a moment is a little paring knife. So it's a little straight edge knife, not a serrated knife. And I'm going to need my rolling pin. So when I roll out my fondant, I'm going to place my fondant on the bench top, and I'm going to roll north to south. There is a tutorial on how I roll out my fondant when I cover my cakes. But literally, as I roll north to south, I stop at the bottom and I stop at the top. In my book, I mentioned they're called love handles. You may not know what love handles are, but they're little fat bits that sort of appear around your waist at some point in your life, you know. Some of you may not ever get them. That's good, but I have them. So as I keep those little fat bits, what happens is my fondant then keeps the shape. Now when I roll out, you can see that the pattern is really quite beautiful that way, and it's also quite beautiful that way. And what I'm going to now use is some spacers. So these are the 3mm acrylic spacers, and I'm going to place them either side of my fondant, and what it's going to allow me to do is to get my fondant to a really nice thin 3mm depth. So as I roll my fondant, and you can see how beautiful this marbling is, it's really quite lovely. I'm going to give it a quarter of a turn, and can you see I've got no corn flour on my bench, because the tip in rolling out your fondant, you really need to roll away from you. A lot of people push downwards and they almost sort of super glue it to the bench, okay? So we don't want to super glue it to the bench, we want to get it nice and free. So as I roll, I'm just going to roll out a little bit more, and you can see my fondant still wants to grow a little bit because it's still quite large. It's still quite thick. So as I roll, now you can see as I roll it's really just not stretching out anymore, because now it's got to the 3mm depth. Now occasionally when I roll out my fondant, sometimes it looks prettier on the other side, but I quite like it the other way this time. And there's a demo of me doing this on another video, and I quite like the other side. So that's beautiful. So what I'm going to do next, I'm going to use my cake template, and I'm going to, my cake board template that is, and I'm going to cut slightly larger around the circle, and I'm using a pizza wheel just to guide me. All my offcuts I can pop in a bag later, I'm not worried about that. And then I'm going to use a cake board, again I'm going to place it positioned down, making sure it's centered. And then using your knife in an upright position, I'm going to just carefully go round. Be careful as you approach your wrist, and then I'm just going to tuck my hand back round that way, and then cut that out. Now, when you've done that, I recommend not using the knife to cut it. I recommend you use your pizza wheel, make a cross, and then you can scoop it out, okay? And then using your pizza wheel, I'm going to cut in half or make a straight line at 12 o'clock. I'm going to bring my cake over to me, and I'm just going to gently just fold that over. And I'm going to lift it up and bring it down to the bottom of my cake board. Now make sure you get it nice and tight to the cake board. You don't want to position it and then have a very, very sort of large gap there. You want to get it nice and snug to the cake board, and then just carefully turn it round and then bring your fondant round over to this section, okay? And then just gently guide that in and bring it all the way round. Now what I'm going to do next, I'm going to remove those 3 balls because there's no water in that area. So what that's going to allow me now is I can overlap that and I can overlap that. And because there's no water, it's not going to be sticking. Whereas if I put water in that area, it'd be really, really sticky. So I'm going to pop that on top of there. And I'm going to put 2 layers on top. And I'm going to use a knife and I'm going to cut down nice and firm. And I'm going to remove that piece of fondant and I'm going to open it up. And then I'm going to push that together and I'm going to smooth it. Now occasionally, sometimes people, when they do this, they don't actually have enough fondant for when it goes round the back because they've not measured it properly. And I want to show you just a little quick tip. So I'm going to be a bit naughty and just cut out an extra piece. And you can clearly see that there's a massive gap there. So what I want to show you is that you can actually stretch your fondant. So you can pick it up and support it and give it a wiggle or a jiggle, okay? And as I wiggle it and jiggle it, can you see it's just stretches? So don't be concerned if you thought, wow, it's not long enough to go all the way around. But you can just lift it up and give it a jiggle and a wiggle, and then you can make it larger. So again, I'm going to use my knife. Now it's important that this knife is really clean. You don't want any bits of fondant on there. And you're going to make sure you're going to cut through both layers, okay? So you're not going to cut this way, you're going to cut on top of both layers. Going to pop your knife blade down. Sometimes I pop my finger there just to stop it from overbalancing and tilting. Just remove that piece of fondant, open that piece up, and then bring that back down together. Okay? So the first thing I'm going to need to do now, I'm going to grab my smoother and I'm going to just smooth all the way around the cake. Make sure your fondant's not lifting up too high up on the sides of the cake. It should be flush all the way around. And you're just going to get your smoother and smooth that. Now for the join, I want to show you how I make that join disappear. So now I'm going to use a flexi smoother, and I've got an obvious join here, so I'm going to just lift this up. And then what I'm going to do, I'm just going to get my smoother and I'm just going to slightly massage the fondant from the right of that join and push it across. And then I'm going to massage it from the left and then push it across. So basically where the cut is, where the join is, I'm going to slightly smooth the fondant to the right, and I'm going to build up the fondant and push it over to the right, and then I'm going to build up the fondant and then push it to the left. And can you see it starts to join and becomes invisible? Okay. Now with my knife, what I like to do next is just use my knife in an upright position. I normally hold it around about 9 o'clock, and I hold it in a nice upright, and I just glide the knife all the way around. As I come to that point, I will park my knife down, rotate my cake, and then pop the knife back into that. I simply just glide the knife around. I don't cut it like Grandma's apple pie, so I don't woody woodpecker it, okay? I glide the knife all the way round. It's important you park the knife when you do this because you don't want to move the cake board and the knife at the same time, okay? So I'm just going to remove all that extra bits of fondant, and you can see here where I've cut it like Grandma's apple pie, it's very raggedy. So I'm just going to go back in and smooth that. Just going to wipe my knife on my apron and just neaten up the sides as well. Okay. Now, one last thing that I do, I do actually check to make sure that the cake board is completely covered. So I just move my little blue, my smoother underneath just to check, and I can see here it's a little bit short. So I'm going to just slightly massage that and bring it back round. And I just like to check that the fondant has completely covered the board. I don't want any little gaps. More so when I place the cake onto a nice tablecloth. If there's a nice white tablecloth, I don't want any bits of silver on my board showing. Now with our cake smoothers, with the old style, the F&M smoothers, I like to put it on flat end down and curvy side up, and I just go all the way around the cake board and I just smooth that. Okay. Now once the fondant has dried, I'll show you later on how I attach my ribbon to my cake board. So that is how I cover my cake board. Please make sure if you use an extra spare board or a chopping board, it's brilliant because then you don't have to handle and move your cake around whilst it's drying. You can just pop it on there. So thank you for watching.